Tanner, thanks for steering this ship that we call Chesapeake Oyster Alliance. You said it best. We're off to doing big things and great things, and we appreciate your guidance and leadership through all that. So anytime I'm asked to give a talk about oysters, the first thing I ask myself is, how can I make oysters sexy? That's a challenge, we all know, right? Well, then my coworker here, Ben Ford, your Miles Y Eastern Bay Riverkeeper, said, don't worry, my wife's already done that. His wife, Kate Livy, you might know, she wrote the Chesapeake Oyster, a fantastic book right about the oysters here in the Chesapeake Bay, very central to what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm excited to introduce our first panel. In short, this panel is going to be about how to increase yield. This is really the bottom line of what the Oyster Alliance is all about. How are we going to get these 10 billion oysters in the water in the most efficient and productive way possible? And so I'm excited to hear from the panelists today. Joining us, we have Mike Congrove from Oyster Seed Holdings, who's going to give us his personal dispatch from a private independent hatchery. Also joining us is Olivia Caretti from the Oyster Recovery Partnership, going to talk about nutrient credit opportunities for the Bay's oyster population. And then Dr. Allison Colden with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, talking about acoustic signatures of oyster healthy reefs. Sorry. So with that, Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you to get started.
Sure. And were we going to have a clicker? Are you guys advancing? Oh,
right there.
Thank you. All right. Thanks, Matt. Let's see. Can everybody hear? Is this here? Okay, great. All right, so Tanner hit me with the title of the talk and kind of gave me free will to decide where we were going to take that. And so I'm taking it in a direction that kind of shows what else we can do as a private hatchery. So as a short introduction, Oyster Seed Holdings is a for-profit company that produces oyster seed for farmers up and down the East Coast. We do that here on Gwen's Island. This is our facility here in the picture. If you take note of those few little red dots at the front of our building there, that big pole barn looking building, we'll get to that in a little bit. But I think one of the most important things to increasing yields and getting more animals into the water is actually growing support and growing demand for oysters and for farm-raised oysters. And so we're trying to hit kind of both sides of that, the production side and then support for it at the very end. So just to orient you real quick for anybody who doesn't know us, we are kind of mid-bay in the Virginia portion of Chesapeake Bay. So I'm kind of going to zoom you in left to right here. In the Virginia portion of the bay, we have the south side, the Middle Peninsula, and Northern Neck. We're on the Middle Peninsula, so if you look at that center panel, that's the eastern side of the Middle Peninsula. And then the very right is pointing at Gwen's Island there, and that's where we're located. And here is picturesque Gwen's Island. Arrows pointing to our facility. We're looking east out into Chesapeake Bay here, and that body of water between the mainland and the island is Milford Haven, and where we draw our water to grow oysters. Here's our humble abode. It's changed a little bit since this picture was taken, quite a few more upweller tanks. But, this represents the brass tacks of what we do, which is oyster production. But what I'm going to do is kind of introduce you to what else OSH has been up to over the last 2 years or so. OSH 2.0, so to speak. Apologies for the formatting there. But we've been a production company. So Oyster Seed Holdings over the last 15 years has produced about 1.2 billion oyster seed, or sold 1.2 billion oyster seed, and sold about 7.2 billion eyed larvae. So those are animals that have gone out into the water for either restoration or, in our case, primarily farm-raised purposes. But in the effort to grow our production, we looked at what we can do to support that effort. So how can we increase support for aquaculture in general and increase demand for shellfish or for oysters specifically, so that farms can continue to grow, so that we can continue to grow more seed to service these growing farms. And basically there's two things that we decided we need to be doing to ensure that we continue to grow at the way that we want to. The first one was through technology. So Oyster Seed Holdings is looking to be a leader in hatchery technology. That includes assessing water quality problems and coming up with systems or treatment techniques that might get us around water quality problems that hamper hatchery production throughout the season. It also includes us looking into other regions that we can't currently operate. So this is bigger than Chesapeake Bay. So rather than being just a regional hatchery, we want to be a national hatchery. We have some portable hatchery technology that we've been working with over the last several years. That allows us to get more oysters produced in areas that we can't currently reach with our brick and mortar facility there on Gwynn's Island. The other thing that we're looking to do is to get ourselves into the advocacy side of things. So again, talk about why shellfish aquaculture is important, get people in to understand how the process works, try to build some community around shellfish aquaculture that will eventually increase demand and also can help support from a political perspective, just kind of the social license to do shellfish aquaculture. There's been some hesitancy with shellfish aquaculture expansions, especially in the last, say, 5 years. And we want to kind of put ourselves on the front line to do our part to make sure that shellfish aquaculture continues to expand. Both of those things, I think, are supportive to our production mission. So we're not getting into these other things for any other reason than so that we can continue to produce more animals for production. So the advocacy thing, it's, in this room, I probably don't need to go over this, but for the benefit of anybody that might be online who's new to this, shellfish aquaculture has this great story to tell. So our idea was, well, let's just tell it. Nothing more complicated than that. Talk about the restorative attributes of shellfish aquaculture, the net positive impact on the environment, one of the few farm-raised proteins that can claim that, healthy nature of the food, and leverage what we do as a hatchery to build that support. So how can we utilize the hatchery to get to the consumer? And it might seem like a bit of a stretch. So this little diagram on the right, the hatchery is over on the very far beginning of the shellfish aquaculture process. And the consumer is over there on the very far right end. And that's who we're trying to build this support in. So the concept was, well, let's just bend that line into a circle. So how do we do that? We look to the very end, to the retail side. So what's the best way to tell the shellfish aquaculture story? It's to eat it. And so we actually reached out to COA in 22 and to try to get this idea off the ground. And so we would, the concept was we would bring people to the hatchery, give them the tour of the hatchery, and then get oysters back from our customers, the people that are growing our seed out to market size and selling to restaurants, wholesalers, et cetera. Get those oysters back, pair them with a wine, put people at a picnic table out on the water and talk to them about aquaculture and why aquaculture is important and try to build this community. That was really well received, actually. We did 7 tours every other Friday over the summer. We had 6 tours with 6 slots available. After the first couple, most of them were overfull. Like we were just kind of fitting people in because we just didn't have enough slots. And over that period of time, or over that 22 summer, we had about 200 attendees, about 2,500 oysters consumed. Part of that effort was to create a virtual tour of the hatchery. So COA also helped fund that. So people that couldn't actually come to the hatchery for a tour, we could provide this virtual or video tour of our hatchery to try to give people an understanding. So we've been utilizing that video in like table setups, locally at least, at trade shows, yes, but also in our little community, if there's like a trade fair or farmers market, those types of things, to try to get the word out to people who may not have seen the hatchery or been able to come. And I think we've been able to reach a diverse demographic doing that. Like we kind of presumed that we get the eco tourists of the world, but we want to get outside of that because we think we already have some support from that particular demographic. So especially these people in our community who have some hesitancy to aquaculture, we want them in the hatchery, we want them eating oysters out front, and we want to talk to them about, have an honest conversation about what the conflicts are and how we can work around those, or put people at ease about the nature of the work that we're doing, to get them on kind of our side of the fence and on the support and community side of things. So to break down, I only got a few graphs, but to break that down, top left is people's knowledge rated between 1 and 5 before they took the tour. 1 is no knowledge, that green bar. 5 is I'm ready to start my own farm. So this was before they took the tour. Sorry, this is a survey that was sent out at the end of the season to all the people that came. The bottom graph is the same question after the tour, rate your knowledge from nothing to starting my farm. And so I feel like we did a pretty good job of moving that needle. We certainly got way more people down into the bottom of the plot than the top part of the plot, and that's encouraging. Outside of what they learned, the one on the top right is just to rate your overall tour experience, 5 being the highest on the bottom. And so people really enjoyed the tours. And one of the biggest pieces of feedback that we got, we just had one little box where you could, write your own comment, was, can we just come back and eat oysters? And so that wasn't something we'd really considered, but this was a bit of a stretch for us to put together every other Friday. It was just a lot of work to pull together. And let's not call it a burden, but there's a financial component to doing this. And that was taking away from what we were doing. We were spending money to do tours rather than spending money to make oysters. And we want to spend our money making oysters. And so we considered that, and we considered the fact that we think we changed or got a lot of people in that had a positive impact on their perspective of aquaculture. And the idea was, well, how can we kind of make this more sustainable? How can we make it pay for itself? How can we keep it going? After a lot of thought and conversation, we decided, well, maybe we can just let them come back and eat oysters. So out of that grew for this year a food truck powered open air oyster eatery. We call it the Hatchery, since we're at the Hatchery. And it's been relatively well received, and we've had a lot of business, and we've been able to keep that conversation going about supporting aquaculture. So we did the same type of every other Friday tours, take people through the Hatchery, but now instead of just getting your little pairing of oysters, we have a fully functional food truck out there that also serves beer and wine. So people can take the tour, come out, hang out at the food truck, eat. We also run the food truck every Friday, Saturday, Sunday from about May to the end of October. And so instead of just 200 people coming through, we had about 2,000 kind of individual tables sat during our first season. So that's a lot more people that we kind of exposed to the idea of shellfish aquaculture. Went up from about 2,000 oysters to 18,000 oysters enjoyed. We have this is our last weekend coming up, so maybe we'll tip the 20K mark, but we're close. And I think converted a lot of new oyster eaters. We're trying to do this in a way where it's approachable. And so we're serving raw oysters with some toppings that we think make it very approachable for people who don't eat oysters, roasted oysters, and then some great menu items like fried oyster sandwich, fried oyster tacos, that type of thing. I really think this has been impactful in getting people just raising the awareness of shellfish culture in our little community and kind of outside of it. So last plot, but just a kind of a fun one. So apologies for the formatting again, it did come out very well, but these are bars of our oyster menus that are in the food truck. I'll just give you the top 3. It was fried oyster tacos, roasted oysters, dozen, and a raw dozen of oysters. And oyster tacos went out for the season, over 400, which would actually be 800 tacos made and served. But I don't know, it was really exciting to see this much kind of, throughput out of it, and just getting people in and being part of the hatchery process. Yeah, I think that's it. So this is the view looking east from our picnic tables. Come visit. You want to get an idea what it is. Thank you to COA. Thank you to the hatchery crew, the food truck crew, everybody that makes this work back in my world. And thanks for listening.
Yeah. Really, Mike, thank you for, bringing this to our attention here. You hit on a really important point, and I think that's advocacy. And, we all need to be advocates of the work we're doing, especially in this oyster space, where we're trying to create more of a demand and get more attention on these important species. So I really enjoyed the process and the data that you were collecting. I think that was really cool to see what people want to eat, what their reactions were and all that. So keep it up. Great work. Thank you. We're going to keep rolling into our next panelist before we get into the question and answers at the end of this here. And so next we have Olivia Caretti from the Oyster Recovery Partnership, and she'll be talking about nutrient credit opportunities for the Chesapeake Bay's oyster production. Great.
Can I stand?
Come on.
Okay.
Well. Yeah.
Okay. Hey guys, I was just in the car for an hour, so I'm gonna stretch my legs a little bit. Yeah, so thanks Tanner for the invite to come and speak. I'm Olivia Caretti. I am the Coastal Restoration Program Manager at Oyster Recovery Partnership. We are a nonprofit working in the Chesapeake Bay, doing large-scale oyster restoration, small-scale oyster restoration, helping to improve sustainable fishing practices and helping to grow aquaculture. So, I think this is a great conference, and our mission really aligns with the mission of the Chesapeake Oyster Alliance. So I work with Oyster Recovery Partnership, but I also am the Oyster Expert BMP Panel Coordinator. So that's a mouthful, but essentially in my 2 years here at ORP, I have also been tasked with helping to coordinate the panel of experts who created the recommendations for the Oyster BMPs. And I'm happy to say that we just got final approval for the second report and all the recommendations therein. So thank you to all the panel members for sticking through this long process. The Oyster BMP expert panel was convened in 2015. So it's been a lot of work and it's been a really long road to get to this point. But we're really excited to finally have approval for these recommendations and looking forward into how we can implement all these recommendations to improve oyster production in the Chesapeake Bay. So I'm just going to kind of give a really broad overview of the oyster BMPs and, just thinking about some of the opportunities for nutrient reduction that they provide. So the oyster BMPs are really focused on the mechanisms through which oysters reduce nutrients in the bay. And there's two main mechanisms that the panel was interested in understanding and quantifying. The first is through biogeochemical processes that are occurring at the reef scale. So in this diagram here, the process of denitrification, where nitrogen is removed and becomes biologically unavailable to any other like algae growth or any other activity. The second is the incorporation of nutrients into oyster biomass as individual oysters are growing. And so, we're looking at the reef scale processes, but also the assimilation of nutrients into the tissue and shell of oysters, individual oysters as they grow. So the oyster BMP requires that an oyster enhancement activity must occur for credit to be accrued. And so the two main oyster enhancement activities that are outlined in these reports are the addition of hatchery produced oysters. So for example, putting out spat on shell, or in an aquaculture setting, putting spat on shell down or putting seed in your cages. And then also, or the addition of suitable substrate. So in Maryland, we do a lot of shell deployment. In Virginia, there's a lot of shell deployment and other materials. So, anything that is a suitable substrate for oysters to settle on. And again, there has to be an oyster enhancement activity going in the water to be eligible for credit. So the second part, so there's kind of two phases. The first part is putting oysters in the water or putting something in the water to improve oyster production. And then nutrients obviously have to be then removed from the water. So they can be removed from the water either via harvest. So those oysters that are growing, they're assimilating nutrients into their tissues and shells, and then you harvest them either through aquaculture or wild harvest. So you're permanently removing those nutrients by removing the oysters. The other way that nutrients are permanently removed is through leaving reefs completely undisturbed. So in a sanctuary setting, restoration in a sanctuary, you're putting out shell, you're putting out spat on shell, and over time that reef biomass is accruing. There's biogeochemical processes happening that are removing nutrients. And the permanent removal here is that all those nutrients are being permanently sequestered in the reef biomass that is undisturbed. So that's kind of the gist of how all these are working. So with that in mind, there's 4 main oyster BMPs that are kind of part of this oyster BMP tool set that we have at our disposal now. So I'm going to walk through each of these just kind of broadly to show you some of the main takeaways and also some of the nutrient reduction potential in numbers that could be acquired. So just briefly, they're the assimilation of nutrients into oysters that are then harvested via aquaculture, the assimilation of nutrients into oysters that are then removed via harvest, and then the assimilation of nutrients in oysters that are restored in a sanctuary, and then also the biogeochemical process of denitrification that's occurring at a restoration reef on the reef scale. So those are the 4 main BMPs, the only BMPs, sorry. Okay, so we'll start with aquaculture. So the aquaculture BMP was approved in 2016. So it's been available to be implemented for a while now, but there's been a lot of barriers to doing this. And so, one thing that ORP is really interested in doing is working with stakeholders to try to identify ways that we can incentivize people to use this. So the main qualifying conditions or key things to keep in mind with the aquaculture BMP is that 1, only oyster tissue can be credited. So obviously, as oysters are growing, they're assimilating nutrients into their tissue and shell. But, the panel felt that it was really important to only credit tissue because they didn't want to accidentally de-incentivize the recycling of shell, right? So oysters are removed from the water, and we obviously want to recycle that shell. Shell is a really valuable resource for all oyster production activities. So the panel felt that if we credit shell, then those shells will end up in a landfill and not go back into the water. And so the same is true for wild harvest, which I'll talk about in a second. The other thing that's important is that verification of those nutrients is required. And so verification in this sense is that we need to track the number of oysters that are harvested when they're harvested and the size generally of what those oysters were when they were harvested. And this is important because the total reduction potential depends on the size of those oysters at the time that they were harvested. And it also depends on the type of oyster. So diploid versus triploid oysters grow differently. They grow at different rates. So therefore, they can assimilate nutrients at different rates. So broadly, the table that you see here at the bottom of the slide is just showing the range of pounds of nitrogen and phosphorus that can be removed or credited per million oysters that are harvested through aquaculture. And again, triploid oysters are growing faster, so they can assimilate nutrients more quickly. So they would ultimately remove more nutrients in the same time period as a diploid oyster. So the range that you're seeing is representing the minimum size of oysters that would be harvested from aquaculture, and so the lowest number is how many pounds you would receive for the minimum size, and then the larger number in that range is the maximum amount that you could receive for the largest oysters that you could harvest. Okay, so each of these I'm going to kind of walk through in the same way. So for harvest, it's very similar to oyster aquaculture. Again, you're removing nutrients by removing oysters. So for this practice, only the enhancement via hatchery produced oysters is eligible because it's really difficult to track what was at a site before it's harvested. So, there has to be a lot of things in place to make sure that we can track the nutrients that are reduced. Again, only oyster tissue can be credited. We don't want to de-incentivize the recycling of shell, and verification is required. And so for this, we need to know the size of oysters and the amount of oysters that are harvested. And so only diploid oysters are eligible because, again, the panel didn't want to accidentally incentivize people to put triploid oysters out on a harvested reef and then harvest them because obviously they can't reproduce. So we want to maintain the multiple function and benefits of putting oysters out regardless of the practice, which Mike touched on within an aquaculture setting. So here's the range at the bottom of the slide again of the potential pounds of nitrogen and phosphorus per million oysters that could be removed for the smallest oysters that you could harvest. So I believe that's 3 inches in both Maryland and Virginia. And then probably the largest oyster that you would realistically be harvesting. Okay, and lastly, there's 2 oyster restoration BMPs. So these are a little bit different because oyster restoration, we really are enhancing the entire reef. So the processes that we're looking at, or the panel's looking at and providing recommendations for, are based on the entire reef scale. So for this, the total reduction is depending on oyster biomass at the reef level. So it's really important for this set of BMPs to quantify the baseline oyster biomass, or what was there before you do the restoration activity, because essentially what's getting credited is the accrual, or the increase in biomass over time. So it's really important to know what was there prior to the restoration activity, and then it's important to track what's there after the restoration activity. So verification and before and after is required. And so as an example, well, before I jump into that, again, there's two mechanisms where nutrients can be reduced through the restoration practices. The first is the assimilation of nitrogen and phosphorus into oyster tissue and shell in this case, because shell is staying in the water, and providing habitat and other benefits for the suite of organisms and processes that are occurring at an oyster reef scale. And then also the biogeochemical process of denitrification that's occurring at the reef scale. So there's two mechanisms for restoration that we really care about. So assimilation, you can get credit for all the nutrients that are assimilated in that oyster biomass over time, as long as biomass is increasing. So if biomass decreases, you don't get any new credit. If biomass stays the same, you don't get any new credit. But if you get an increase in biomass every time you go out and measure it, you get credit. Denitrification is a constant process that's occurring continually. So as long as you're maintaining or increasing biomass above the baseline, you can get credit for that process. So that's kind of a lot, but the gist of it is, for as an example, for a healthy restored oyster reef that is at oyster biomass, average oyster biomass of 50 grams of dry weight per square meter, which is our target biomass that we are trying to restore to, at least in Maryland, as part of the Chesapeake Bay Agreement. So I use that as an example. So for a reef of that biomass, let's say it's a 1 acre reef, you could get up to 77 pounds of nitrogen per acre through assimilation, and then 12 pounds of phosphorus per acre through assimilation. And then for denitrification, you can get up to 97 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year, for up to 3 years until you reassess oyster biomass. So it's a little more complicated, but I'm happy to answer questions and or talk to anyone after this if they have questions. Okay, so just to kind of think about, most of these just got approved. How are we going to use them? What's the potential? So, we're really excited because we think the BMP could support the TMDL goals for coastal counties through their watershed implementation plans. Obviously, there's a lot of legalese around this, but I think it's a really good opportunity for coastal counties to take advantage of this. These BMPs also could provide additional revenue to the growing aquaculture industry, as Mike hit on. There's a lot of challenges and there's been some roadblocks to expanding aquaculture in the Chesapeake Bay. And I think that, this could really incentivize or provide additional funding to do that. And then lastly, the BMPs could attract private funding for oyster restoration, both in a sanctuary setting and then also the enhancement of areas that are open to harvest. So, we're really excited about all these opportunities. And I think I'm out of time, so I'll just say if the slides are shared, here's the link to the reports. And if you have questions, come talk to me or send me an email. Thanks.
Awesome. Oh, that's great. Thank you so much, Olivia. Very informative. I'm sure you're going to get some questions. Just a reminder, everybody online, put your questions in the chat and we'll get to those after our next panelist. Real quick, I was doing the math. Okay. So last night I consumed 3 dozen oysters. Don't judge me. 0.00036 pounds of nitrogen were pulled out from my consumption of 3 dozen oysters. So we can all do our part. Eat more oysters. Awesome. Well, moving on next, we have Dr. Allison Colden with Chesapeake Bay Foundation, who will be talking about acoustic signatures of healthy reefs. Yeah. Allison?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to telling you all about some work that Chesapeake Bay Foundation has been working on over the past couple of years to try and increase the safety, the efficiency, and other characteristics of our oyster reef monitoring program. Not only do we think this is going to be really helpful in understanding what's going on reefs throughout the bay, but also have a tremendous opportunity to make monitoring more cost effective, and hopefully saving us money that we can then put towards more oyster restoration. So getting back to our theme of increasing yields, being able to be more cost efficient in everything that we do will help make sure that we're getting more and more oysters into the bay. So first, for folks who aren't familiar, I wanted to introduce the concept of a soundscape. This is a concept that was originally developed or introduced in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and primarily within the context of the terrestrial landscape, as well as the connection between nature and the human environment. Over the years, there have been many different definitions proposed for soundscape, but a lot of people reference this definition, which was proposed by Farina in 2014, who wrote one of the sort of seminal texts on soundscape ecology, which is the acoustic context produced in and in turn perceived in different ways by both animals and humans. So the photo here of the forest is really referencing that the majority of this work was based in terrestrial ecosystems. A lot of you may be familiar, for example, with the soundscapes of bird sounds. If any of you are familiar, there's an app that I like to use called Merlin. You can actually just hold your phone up and record different bird sounds, and it'll identify what birds you're listening to. So there's been a tremendous amount of work in the terrestrial landscape, as well as how humans perceive and interact with the natural environment. This is kind of where the first concept of noise pollution came in, as we were looking at the impacts of urban and suburbanization on human communities. So that's sort of the concept of a soundscape writ large. But I also wanted to point out in the marine space that this is a relatively new and fast growing field. So this is a figure from Havlik et al. 2022, which is sort of a review of the state of the science for marine soundscape research. And the dotted line that you see on the graph sort of shows the cumulative number of papers that have been written in the marine system. And you can see it's really only been over the last 10 years that we have seen a large increase in research in this area. Also, you can see that the distribution of where these soundscape studies are happening is pretty skewed towards these shallow coastal environments, which is great for us because that's where oysters occur. But it also means that we are still relatively limited in our understanding and knowledge of soundscape ecology overall. And this is another figure from the same paper, which shows where all of our efforts in soundscape ecology have been focused both geographically as well as across different ecosystems. You'll see here that the US does have a good number of studies, but there's a lot of blue dots here, very few purple. You'll see North Carolina, and there may be a couple others tucked underneath there, but the majority have been happening in coastal habitats, pelagic habitats, and the breakdown over here shows in purple, only 2% of the studies have focused on oyster reef ecosystems. So within soundscape ecology, marine is less common than terrestrial, and within the marine soundscape research environment, oyster reefs are one of the less studied ecosystems. That being said, we are fortunate to have had some oyster reef soundscape research happening right here in the Choptank in Harris Creek. In 2015, 2016 timeframe, there were acoustic receivers or hydrophones placed out on restored reefs in Harris Creek that measured the frequency of boat whistles for our friend, the reef resident oyster toadfish. This is a great species to listen for, one, because they are a soniferous fish, so they do make noise that is distinguishable. If you guys have ever caught one, you've probably heard them make their grunt at you as you're trying to dehook them. They're also a reef resident, so they are very closely associated with oyster reefs directly. They are very good indicator species of reef habitat. And basically what this study has showed is there were a lot of environmental variables which correlated with like the frequency of the oyster toadfish calls. But probably what's of most interest for this group and for us was what is the relationship of the characteristics of the oyster reef associated with the acoustic signature from oyster toadfish boat whistle calls. And so on the left-hand side, you can see it's oyster density on the x-axis and the average call rate on the y-axis. And as you had increasing oyster density, the number of oysters per square meter, you also saw an increase in the number of oyster toadfish calls that were being captured. Otherwise, that's shown here as well between unrestored reefs on the left and restored reefs on the right. In general, you get a higher median number of calls on restored reefs versus unrestored reefs. So this suggests that there is some sort of correlation between habitat characteristics, maybe you could say habitat quality, and the acoustic signature, at least with respect to this one species of oyster toadfish. So this is something the Chesapeake Bay Foundation was really interested in from a number of different perspectives. Chesapeake Bay Foundation has had our own oyster restoration program for more than 20 years, but we've also been a partner in the larger efforts to restore the 10 tributaries in Maryland and Virginia by 2025. And both of those efforts require a tremendous amount of monitoring. Olivia mentioned earlier that there are specific success metrics, particularly related to oyster biomass and density, that require a tremendous amount of effort for monitoring. So for our own projects and for the broader restoration community, we were interested in exploring further how acoustic soundscapes could act as a proxy for these oyster reef characteristics and metrics that are of interest to the broader restoration community. So we worked with Northrop Grumman and their engineers to develop 3 high-fidelity hydrophones, which are seen here with our intrepid interns last summer who were testing them. These hydrophones are extremely high resolution. The point of that is to try and capture specific signatures for other species like croaker, drum, the toadfish. We deployed them for 12 hours from dusk to dawn to try and capture some of the times of day when species are most active. And then we also chose sites to sample areas that had been previously characterized by rapid assessment and or diver sampling. So we wanted to go to places that we had a known condition that had either been sampled by the broad scale diver sampling program that goes on, or a rapid assessment protocol, which you'll hear a little bit more about later this afternoon, that's carried out by the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center and has developed a ranking system for habitat characteristics. So far, we have sampled Harris Creek, the Severn River, the South River, and the Magothy River. I did just want to mention briefly that all of the components that were used to create these hydrophones are off the shelf. It was really important for us when we were working with Northrop Grumman. Obviously, they have access to a lot of proprietary gear and a lot of proprietary things, but we wanted to make sure that these would be something that we could put out blueprints for and have other groups and organizations who are interested be able to construct their own hydrophones once we are able to show that they're able to capture the species and the habitat characteristics that we're interested in. So that was really important for us in developing this project, that it would be accessible to other organizations. So right now, what we're working on is we've collected a tremendous amount of data. We are working on developing, using AI and machine learning models to develop a classifier system, which can basically parse through all of that tremendous amount of data and start to pull out some points of interest. And so it's going to be identifying specific species. So for species that we have reference information on, like the toadfish, like some of the drums and croakers, we can develop specific classifiers. It will pull out those specific calls from the data. But the other thing that we're really interested in looking at, relating back to that classifier, rapid assessment classifier, is looking at the soundscape holistically and seeing if we can identify natural breaks in our data, whether that's the diversity of the soundscape, whether that's the amplitude, or basically the loudness of the sounds that we get off of that reef, identifying whether we see different groupings in that data, which would line up with the habitat quality classifications that have been developed by video and diver sampling. So we're working on those classifiers now with Northrop Grumman, and hopefully we'll come out with some great models that'll help parse through a tremendous amount of data that you get back when you have hydrophones sitting out there for 12 hours at a time. The next thing that we're working on is actually also working on sound projections. So there have been some work in North Carolina that showed that manipulating the soundscape by adding the sounds of a healthy oyster reef, basically projecting healthy oyster reef sounds, helps to increase larval settlement and recruitment to oyster reefs. So what you see on the right-hand side is actually a solar-powered buoy that we have built with a sound projector built into it based on some prototypes from Australia. And so we have this built and will be field tested this winter, and will provide us a means to go anywhere in the bay and deploy this so that it can project healthy reef sounds. We will likely use some of our recordings from Harris Creek for that, to determine whether we can increase or induce larval settlement using that reef soundscape noise. So the applications to restoration, we think there are a couple of different things that make this really exciting. I mean, this is what we have at our disposal now for oyster reef monitoring. On the left, you have obviously a diver in some murky, cloudy water. On the right, you have another piece of equipment which CBF helped develop called the Clearwater Box. Both have very small areas that they're sampling, can be very difficult depending upon the environmental conditions. So as I mentioned previously, we think that this could be an opportunity to do a broad scale classification of a large area of oyster reef based on the soundscape and what we're hearing and how that relates to different habitat characteristics. We also are interested in seeing if we see positive results from the sound projection, if it can be used in other types of new approaches that people are piloting right now. So for example, direct setting or in situ setting, there are folks working on that. There may be an opportunity to pair sound projection with direct setting to see if we can help increase the rates of larval settlement or help to induce larval settlement by putting those two techniques together. So we think that there could be some great applications to restoration, which will help increase the efficiency of both monitoring and some of these new innovative approaches that folks are working on. I do think that there's several important outstanding questions that we still need to look at and consider. So when you are manipulating the soundscape, you do have animals that are responding to those specific auditory cues. And so there is sort of a question sort of lingering out there. If we are actively manipulating the soundscape, how does that affect other species? How does that affect their ecological interactions? We know, for example, that chemical cues given off by predators can have important trophic cascading interactions on oyster reefs, things like mud crabs and blue crabs and their impacts on oysters. And there may be similar types of impacts to those ecological interactions by these auditory cues. We're not really sure at this point what aspects of that reef soundscape oyster larvae are responding to. So is it a specific species that they hear? Is it the vibrations? Is it, the clapping of adult oyster shells that they're responding to? The level of what they're responding to is not really clear at this point. We just know that playing back the whole reef soundscape seems to have a positive impact on larval settlement. And then lastly, I think the utility of this as a broad scale tool is really going to depend upon if the reef quality and the characteristics that we care about, density, biomass, things like that, can be resolved at a scale that would be a useful proxy for physical sampling. So we would not be able to replace physical sampling to determine if we are meeting our success metrics if this is not able to be resolved at a scale that's relevant to that. So right now, everything's being resolved at a square meter and being estimated up to a per acre basis. So we need to be able to at least resolve on a per acre basis if these acoustic cues are consistent across that similar spatial area or not, and are they reflecting a similar response as the physical sampling is. So, well, none of those are supposed to be in there. There we go. So I just wanted to end, as I mentioned earlier, it is our goal that CBF is working hard to develop this technology, but we would really love to make it available. So if any of this was of interest to you, or you have ideas for places where we could put out our hydrophones that you think would be of interest, I wanted to provide my contact information. Please reach out. We look forward to making this technology and this approach available to other partners as much as possible. So we look forward to working with you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Allison. I gotta say, you blew me out of the water. I tried to make oyster sexy and you just made oyster toadfish sexy. That was great. I'm really excited to see where you take that research and how we can apply it here in the Bay. So thank you again to all the panelists. Can we give one big round of applause to everyone? We really appreciate all of your work, hard work, and dedication in making the Chesapeake Bay oyster population even better every year that we work on this. We're going to hit the Q&A section now. So first, we're going to turn it over to our folks online and see what questions have come through the Zoom.
All right, Olivia, grab a hat, hold on to it.
Oh boy.
So starting off, how does wild harvest satisfy the requirement to first enhance oyster habitat?
Okay, so the key to the wild harvest BMP is that there still has to be an enhancement activity that occurs before harvest can be credited. So the addition of spat on shell or hatchery produced oysters is required at the BMP site. And then there's a lag time between when you would deploy those and then when the harvest would be allowed to get credit. So that's all in the report, but yeah, that's kind of the gist.
Okay, do we want to go back and forth, see if we have anybody from the audience here with a question? Yeah. Okay, the question for Olivia is who would get those credits?
Okay, so that's a great question. Ultimately the way that this is going to be implemented is completely up to DNR and VMRC. So the states are the ones that are going to be developing the implementation plan and kind of enforcing that. I know that there's, a lot of interest in like private groups getting those credits. And so I think that there is probably a way to merge all of them together, but ultimately, we at ORP are trying to talk to people to just gauge like, how's it going to work? What is the interest? Who's going to get the credits? How, like, when are they going to get the credits? And so, ultimately it has to go through the states first, and they're going to be the ones that are managing all of that directly. So that's probably not the best answer, but
well, I think you hit
complicated.
And I think you hit a question that I had too. This applies Bay-wide then, Virginia and Maryland,
Yes,
correct?
Bay-wide.
And then the agencies in those states are responsible for managing the BMP.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, let's go online.
Okay, so what is the timescale for before and after on the nutrient reduction potential for the restoration projects?
Okay, so you mean before and after, so doing the before monitoring and the after restoration monitoring, I'm assuming?
I'm not sure.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. So it's in the report and I can't remember exactly off the top of my head. But there is I think you need to do the before sampling within a year or two, within 2 years of doing the restoration, and then after can be anytime after. The panel is recommending monitoring after restoration every 3 years because that coincides with when the denitrification credits expire. But the after time frame can be totally up to the monitoring group or the implementer. Yeah.
Okay, let's jump to the audience here.
Thank you guys, and thanks for the great panel. 2 questions, one for Olivia and one for Mike. So for Olivia, you just kind of went over the overview of the programs, and I think for growers in industry, it can be a little confusing. There's, we had nutrient credit trading authorized, and then there's the Clean Water Commerce Act money. Now there's a pilot program through DNR in terms of, reimbursing growers for the ecosystem services. So I don't know if it sounds like there's a lot still to be determined, but it's just something to make a note. I think, cohesiveness and, being able to project out would be really helpful for growers, because I think a lot of people are thinking down the road, like, is this going to happen? Can we build this into our business model or business planning? So it's just more of a comment, but it sounds like, you kind of answered with your last question. And then for Mike, it's more of a fun question. I mean, how did you find going from, working in the hatchery to interacting with the public on the weekends and dealing with all that? Because I think a lot of growers in the back of their mind are like, oh, that'd be cool to, have a restaurant or some kind of, food truck, but it's probably very challenging, I would think.
Sure.
I think there are definitely some challenges. I think it's an effort worth undertaking. And I think the more people working in that space, the better off we are as a whole, kind of a rising tide floats all boats thing. But yeah, I don't know. Motivated people, supportive staff. Like, it was really awesome that the hatchery crew was willing to put in those hours, mostly voluntarily. You know, they work on tips too. But to get kind of that tour effort off the ground, you know. After that, we were lucky enough that one of the hatchery staff is a bit of a foodie and spent some time in food service, and so helped. He's the chef of the food truck, and so that we kind of lucked out on in terms of moving forward, like taking it a step farther into the food truck. Yeah, challenging but worth it. Yeah.
Yes, for nutrient reduction, what techniques are used to create baseline and verify?
Okay, so this is a place where you would want to consult an expert in oyster sampling, because, you know, we need to have a robust survey, ideally, to get a good estimate of the biomass that's there beforehand. So reach out to your local oyster sampling expert. There's a whole variety of ways that you can sample a reef, but the panel is really emphasizing in the report, like, it needs to be done scientifically, accurately, and done well to get a good estimate. Yeah. So that was a vague answer, but use science. Sorry.
Yeah, Bill Walton from VIMS. Allison, I had a question. Thinking about the soundscape work, I've been thinking about from the private shellfish aquaculture, what types of, whether it's chemical cues or sound cues, the private industry could use. And certainly, when I think about the soundscape, it seems to me shell is so valuable now that if we're putting shell overboard, anything we can do to maximize those returns seem to be valuable. So, and that would be true, I would think, in terms of both private aquaculture as well as restoration. So have you thought about engaging with any private leases, testing this?
We haven't yet, but would love to work on that. The other thing that I think is really advantageous about this, you mentioned before, chemical cues. I know that there have been some folks who were interested in introducing certain chemicals in situ to try and induce settling, which of course has its own challenges, its own concerns associated with this. This is something that's very short term. It's natural sound that occurs in the environment on these types of ecosystems. I did mention we have some concerns about whether continuing to manipulate that beyond what's natural in the environment would have any, knock-on effects. But at the end of the day, relative to some of these other cues that people are interested in using, it's I think pretty benign. So I think it would be a good opportunity to engage with the industry, and I encourage anyone who's interested to reach out, because we would love to see as many contexts as we can use this technology in. Love to see that move forward.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Yeah, sure. This is a question from an oyster grower, wanting to know that, if you're not in Maryland, or if you're anywhere in the Chesapeake Bay, can you qualify for nutrient credits?
Yeah, so the BMPs apply bay-wide. So if you're not in Maryland and you're operating in Virginia, then you're within the area that this could occur. But again, it's the states are the ones that have to decide how it's going to be implemented. So I think we're all kind of waiting for that process to kind of end. But yeah, long story short, you can be anywhere in the Chesapeake Bay, but you can harvest oysters or you can have a lease. Yeah.
Flip over to Matthew.
Thank you. So, a kind of a complaint that I've heard from growers before is that they want to make inroads with communities that are far from the bay, and they want to get their products deeper into the territory. So I'm wondering, of the people that visited your food trucks, did you happen to capture where they were coming from? And is that the fact that they can go on a tour and then eat oysters? Do you see that as facilitating that?
Yeah, I mean, only anecdotally, unfortunately. We don't have any hard numbers on that, but we did find that we were pulling more widely than we anticipated, and especially in the second year. So for anybody who has an idea, I mean, I was gonna say individual cities, and maybe I still will, but we didn't get much farther than, say, an hour and a half, except for the kind of oddball, like family was visiting from Pennsylvania, and so they came. But generally speaking now, where we are, we're there's a hour and a half circle to some more populated areas. So we're getting into Richmond, the capital of Virginia, down into Hampton Roads and even Virginia Beach, and a handful, oh, sorry. Yeah, and a handful from DC area. So I think it is starting to expand out. I think maybe a better model would be to have these types of experiences that could happen more in these industrial or larger urban centers. Obviously, it wouldn't be exactly the same, but some type of virtual tour environment, I think, is important to at least get people thinking about it, and maybe then you get them to make the trip. Yeah.
Allison, so many of the tributaries where you sail have a lot of boat traffic. How does man-made noise pollution affect the data, or does it have an impact?
Has a very large impact. So we try and mitigate that as much as possible. One, with our dusk to dawn sampling. So hoping that there's not going to be as many boats out at night when it's dark. That's also when some of the other species or some of the fish species are pretty active around those dawn and dusk time periods. So that's another thing that we're hoping to work on through our classifier system, is not only to identify points of interest, but also to eliminate things that we know are not of interest. It's pretty easy if you're just listening to the sound files to pick out a boat, because you can hear it coming, and then you can hear the propeller noise, and then you can hear it continue on. So we're hoping that the classifier will be able to clean the data as much as it will be able to identify specific species that we're looking for.
Anybody else in here in person?
So that I kind of just had an idea from listening to that. Have you ever considered noise canceling? If you're projecting sound, have you ever considered trying that out? Like, if you know what a motor sounds like, got this classifying system, you've got a speaker underwater. Can you cancel out that noise?
It's a great question. I don't know.
Say that one for Sony.
Oyster headphones.
Yeah. All right, David, you have a question about Mike?
Oh, we do. We still have time.
We have 5 minutes.
Okay. Let's see. Mike, you mentioned well, in terms of your success with the food truck and things like that. Do you have any insight into the success of your efforts with decision makers?
Yeah, so we haven't had any decision makers out to the food truck yet. I mean, I suppose there were some considerations in supporting some lobbying efforts, like down in Richmond, by actually bringing the food truck there. But I think, I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of efforts like that happen, at least in our world, for lobbying purposes, where there might be some oysters prepared on site and served at a lunch or a dinner, in Richmond, for lobbying purposes or trying to get people to understand. I certainly think it's a good tool. We haven't tried to apply it there yet, but yeah, I think it's certainly a tool you could use in that scenario.
Just to that point, one of the slides we introduced, we have an event called Oysters on Capitol, where we connect the growers directly with the legislators. And
Sure.
I think we went through like 3,000 oysters
Yeah.
in like 40 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very
Yeah.
popular.
Like I said, I mean, one of the best ways to teach aquaculture is to eat it. Yeah.
That's right. Got a question to ask here.
This question's for Allison. I was wondering has there been any focus with all the papers that have obviously come out in the last 10 years? Sometimes you can learn by what's not there as well. So is there focus on not hearing toadfish? And is that a sign of impending mortality issues, or has there been a big focus on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question and an interesting approach. I have not seen papers yet that have approached as like an early warning system, if you want to call it that. But obviously we have seen in our data, particularly because we have basically looked at unrestored areas in some of the Western Shore tributaries in Maryland compared to Harris Creek. It is a stark difference. When you listen to those files, it's eerily quiet, with the exception of the jet skis. And so I think that there would likely be a way to do that. I think that would be further down the line, since we're just at sort of the beginning of characterizing restored, unrestored, healthy, less healthy, unrestored, those sorts of comparisons. And I think once we better understand that, you would be able to sort of track over time. If you went back to a same reef and if it were degrading, for example, you would be able to track that decline if you had that baseline information. But I think that's kind of the next step from where we are currently, at least within CBF.
Thank you.
We're running with 2 minutes left. We have one quick one. Yeah.
Okay, so follow up to Allison's talk and related to the shell limitation concern you related. The toadfish calls to density, which worked. Was the type of restoration shell versus stone looked at? This would be a proxy for habitat complexity, as the stone seems to provide a more complex habitat structure.
So I know in that study specifically, they looked at 8 different reefs within Harris Creek. I don't remember off the top of my head whether they were stone or shell reefs, but I can reference that back in the paper and get back to you. We do know, from looking at some of the sampling data, that there's likely differences in the abundance of oysters on those. So if it's scaling with the abundance of oysters and the complexity of that reef, I would expect that to scale as well. But related to that specific study that I presented, I don't have that on hand at the moment.
Great. Okay. Well, with that, I want to ask everyone to give our panelists one more round of applause. This has been extremely informative. I'm excited with all the questions that have been coming through in person here and online. So keep that rolling as we move forward. I guess one last question I'm going to leave the group with, and maybe everyone in the audience online and virtually, if you want to weigh in there, but the idea of demand and how do we increase demand? I'm curious, what are some of the innovative ways people are thinking about how to get more oysters into consumers' hands and eventually in their mouth and eating all that nitrogen. But, Mike, you had a great example of bringing people right to the brick and mortar. I think we can capitalize off that. There's the topic of the SOAR program last year, getting aquaculture involved in restoration. And so maybe if you have any ideas or any questions, I'll just leave it with that, throw it in the chat and we'll be able to talk about it later. But again, thank you to the panelists and thank you for the crowd. I'm going to turn it back over to Tanner.